Hello everyone, today we talk about the Protestant influence in the development of early modern discipline in Europe and beyond, given that of course the latter was overflowing, and also thanks to the Protestant powers not only. This is actually a reflection on not just the thoughts of specific scholars such as Machiavelli's Justus Lipsius. By the way, we will pass through Machiavelli, especially Justus Lipsius, passing through Maurice of Nassau and Thomas Harrison, but also a sort of introduction to a specific aspect of Protestant asceticism that brought to, again, some also ironic consequences, such as essentially the revival of what had been the medieval Catholic, dress code and common life, etc., that had been disconfessed by the Reformation. But of course, it's a much deeper thing that cannot, in fact, overshadow the most obvious evidence that the Catholic and the Protestant world were mutually influencing each other in this pretty homogeneous development of Western warfare. At that point, that could have not been that effective in many ways if it had not contained, it had not deeply ingrained within itself this perennial conflict, after all, within this compact but so variegated continent. All right, so this is, of course, that you understand why we will never stop making videos, at least until I leave, or I can't sustain this in any other way, because it's never like, today let's talk about this core of this unit or this general whatever. This is about what those were contextualized in, right? Historically, morally, metaphysically even. And it's important to start from the same feudal fidelitas, right? Today we talk mainly discipline, and we observe essentially the development of the collective one throughout the Renaissance and beyond. As you know, and we have seen it in many videos about pike and shot warfare, essentially the early modern state in its centralization manages to confer, for the first time after a long time, to say the least, an adequate, as brutal, uniform discipline that is the same one that allows the same aforementioned pike squares to march that orderly, to be intensively training and carrying out counter marches immediately, to maintain this sort of geometrical, mathematical, precise order that in part was inspired, in fact, to the treatise on ancient military discipline that, as you know, were pretty much the thing of the Renaissance in both the Catholic and the Protestant world. As you know, I also made multiple videos about Maurice of Nassau and Gustavus Adolphus, so if you're curious specifically of about some further and strictly military background, you can always check that out, and we will come back on the topic, of course, unavoidably as well. During the Middle Ages, and you know that as a medievalist and a military historian, of course, one of my first duties here is to debunk any myth about the alleged, in fact, backwardness of the medieval art of war. But of course, were the expression of a specific political and social system that had not been able to impress such a large and uniform discipline among the soldiery in the past, right? Things would evolve throughout the same modern era, and we will hopefully look at that too. But of course, when we look at medieval Europe, the first, let's say, we can speak of a largely feudal continent. Yes, there could be city-states, other, say, forms of, say, eventually towards the end of the millennium of statal development, etc. But still, we are living in, especially in this passage from late medieval to the early modern, in the typically ancien regime world, that was essentially a feudal system, right? Still recognized fundamentally universal authorities, or even when, in the case of the Protestant Reformation, disconfessing them in part, still essentially having a hierarchical system that was based more or less on, was in the case of universal authorities, was just taking off like the very top, right? But all the rest working essentially like before and implementing on bases that were the ones of the old feudal Feudalitas, right? Which stems from fides, that, as you know, was in antiquity, in the Latin world, a very strong concept that fundamentally revolved around political cohesion, right? The idea that the fides was of course, as always, a mutual relation. This existed in a religious sense towards God as much as the imperatores, the war band leaders, and anybody who had, in fact, a role in the of leadership in the military system. I also made a video about the traditional meaning of leadership, discipline, etc. So that's very connected to it. I will surely post it down below in the top fixed comment. The feudal Feudalitas had been working fundamentally in the same way. The idea is that there is a lord that was technically, again, the same war band leader back in the day, the senior with the Vassi or with the Masnata, so that even when you look at the quite advanced and sophisticated late medieval warfare, you realize that essentially the indenture, the condotta, all these various mercenary companies that you could find around, that basically made up the bulk of contemporary armies at this point, was just an evolution of the same system, and that the same concept of leadership by extension in a political and social sense had a lot to do with that, right? I plan time allowing to start doing something also about late medieval mercenaries, the condottas, etc., because we're just entering a bit, even after years, in this kind of details, and there is a lot there to be dug in terms of state building as well, right? So when we look at the feudal Fidelitas, that entails surely an oath, this sense of sort of initiation, very adulterated compared to the atrocious tortures basically that had existed in ancient times, and that, I don't think in the Middle Ages had really changed that much in terms of mental and physical requirements, was essentially seen as a personal connection, right? Here we can't, the thing I criticize myself about this definition, it's looking at the either half full or empty glass, right? You can't quite draw a line rigidly, but it's a that from the sort of clanic, sort of mafia-like, pre-statal mentality into the, in fact, more centralized system, and properly the building of a firm establishment with a major political territorial control, it's obvious that what had constituted the individual relations between those guys that literally lived out there in the wild as even outlaws, with a leader who was considered as the medium of the divinity, and these warriors were just not belonging to themselves anymore and just living as packs of wolves under the command of these guys, and the affirmation of sort of pre-statal, semi-permanent, and somehow rigid military structures, as we've seen also in the Bande d'Ordonnance. We've seen it for late medieval warfare. Then again, the condotta, the indenture, they all work pretty much in the same way, but in a much more statalized context. There is a switch, right, from these sort of I know you, you know me, to some sort of faceless state that becomes sort of a hypostatic authority. That is a bit the problem. I made a video about populism recently when talking about exactly 16th century, the attitude of Western Europeans towards the Ottoman expansion exactly in these centuries is a bit like the complaint again, of those people who say, the government runs everything, it's all a conspiracy, and all that stuff, because while it is true that there is a divide, let's say, between the establishment and some part of the population, let's say the latter's myopia in terms of what actually happens, also in terms of participating to the state and being able to take over, realizing that nobody can really control somebody else's mind unless that person accepts willingly to be controlled, even when denying it, right? It really explains most of what history really gets down to, and how our life, our actions really are, right? So there is an idea that, when we look at things like the feudal fidelitas, we're not looking exactly at obedience just per se. I disagree with this, right? Because there was always that degree, right? But there is no doubt that when we look at discipline, subordination, etc., the world was much more unregulated than in later times, right? It is true that, as you know, that mercenaries were often not really too loyal, but this doesn't mean actually that the native militias were actually any better in that same loyalty. More than else, whenever you see that these units, these actual independent armies at some point escaped the control of political authorities because the latter either wanted to get rid of them and or they didn't have the money to pay them, rather than these troops having any greater or smaller inclination towards betrayal, right? Which is a myth that, as we'll see now, as you know, was pretty alive already in Machiavelli's times, but it's also a romantic, nationalistic myth of nation-state in the 19th century, and I just made a video about that rhetoric recently, actually 3 videos that were supposed to be one, but they ended up being like 6 hours, split in 3. Yet this central authority increases in importance, and of course together with it the effort to create some troops which are really dependent on the sovereign, right? That at this point, like at the turning of the eras, say medieval into modern, are really, we can't say not completely irrelevant, but largely again mercenary. I'd say that this armies, royal or imperial, whatever, were mostly about mercenaries, right? And then other militias and vassals, etc. So they were pretty mixed, and they sort of remained like that, as they had been actually for a good part of the Middle Ages until pretty late in time, right? The second half of the 17th century in practice, and even there with still an important degree of privatization of clienterly connections, and still with, in fact, the idea that there was a sort of personal connection with authority. That is to say, before the French Revolution, the sense was not that there was quite a state with a fixed nation, with a fixed sort of standard uniform administrator, none of that, right? There was essentially a race, right? There was essentially a dynasty, a stock that had the God-given right to rule practically on every other person because they had earned that, as they were truly superior to them, right? And this was essentially still, we don't speak cases, we think about the Vedas or India when we think about cases, but when you look at the first, second, third, fourth estate, right, that's technically actually the same relic of case division with very specific functions back in the day, and we sort of lost, of course, touch with that meaning, but it was truly felt like war was like a sport of kings, right, and of aristocrats that had their own personal retinues, clienteles, peasants working the land, breaking their backs for them, right? And after all, the world was truly like that, was truly not truly unitary in Statel. There's a big deal of post-Westphalianism and whatever. There's no doubt, again, as I just said, that the second half of the 17th century was a huge deal in that sort of stepping further, much more than the alleged military revolution. It never ended. It never happened, but for some reason was ended, like in the historiographical invention, exactly when eventually there is I don't like the term revolution, but if you really wanted to make this sensationalism about literal explosion, you don't make the military revolution end in the moment in which the way more important one begins, and you don't even term it like that. So if that half of a millennium to pass from, pikes to muskets, is a revolution, what happened with Louis XIV, really? What's the term that we should be using? The Big Bang, or, just think about even the later mass society or whatever. So just for finally getting rid once for all of those sort of fireworks. This war truly remained until the Code Napoleon, rather, and there were some countries in Europe that fundamentally never, in spite of centralization, statalization, uniformation, never fully abandoned that originary concept until 1918, right? So throughout all this, you understand that there is a path to discipline. That the more concentrated power became, the most traumatically yet effectively brutal training succeeded in the most beautiful creation of pure killing machines that know exactly what to do on the battlefield, to move at unison, to slaughter any single person they find in front of them, because that's the only single purpose that the military must have by God-given right. And this is still actually part of the entire path to civilization. If you are confused in that sense which relation tradition and civilization interact, always bear in mind that no, the idea that yes, that tendentially things always get worse, we expect that, but doesn't mean that there aren't ups and downs, and that especially this is to remember that anything that works truly in practice and that wins over others, the level could be collapsed in a sense, but as long as somebody succeeds, right, and someone succeeds over someone else, that is the better model, right? Either because the other guy got too weak, even when inspired to the original true forms, or because the other really had, or it's both at the same time, had still something traditional, actually, that even under some other title, slogan, or sort of degenerate ideology, still basically and spiritually, right, manages to put at work, right? So when we look at the late Middle Ages, there is no doubt that the mercenaries knew and observed a specific code, right? Let's get rid of this idea that mercenaries were just not susceptible to, chivalric ideals, that, the aristocracy was just, immediately Machiavellized, as if that had ever concretely happened at some point. I mean, the establishment and the military of early medieval Europe fundamentally still remain the same. We made so many videos about the Battle of Vienna, Prince Eugene. Yes, there were countries in Europe that were more or less, say, traditional, or more or less modern, conversely. But overall, right, thinking that just by contrast, in contrast with the Middle Ages, now a completely ruthless, realpolitik, Machiavellic ideology had unhinged everything. By the early modern age, it's really not true, right? It's just a wrong impression that was built by modernists and positivists, essentially, to say, this is modernity, we're cool, that's where it began, right? And the Middle Ages were bad, and there was this huge leap forward, and this is not really what happened, right? Yes, there were big changes, but and they had to do in part with this, but they were not actually eliminating that previous world, nor warfare before that had actually been that different at all, right? And it had been as bloody, as brutal, as merciless as any other, right? And so even this sort of classistic complex for which we think that finally infantrymen began to kill knights, so this is the great birth of democracy and republic. Absolutely not. These were ancien regime armies made up by proletarians that didn't have practically any sort of political or social relevance, paid, armed, equipped, trained by the single most prosperous and successful princes, monarchs of Europe at the time, which are the ones that under whom the really big European expansion, even colonialism, etc., really happened, and under which what we call modernity, actually, these achievements were obtained. So, I will always encounter people that belonging to my generation, in part even before or later, will think that this was a great time in the freeing of the individual, but this was exactly the opposite, right? And it's not even a negative thing. That's the point I would like to stress, because you have to understand who does go under and who does remain at the top, and what they're able to do, and it's the combination between the two that actually matters in that success. So the simple equations in history do not exist. Direct proportionality, dualism does not exist, and there is at least always both at the same time, and it's again the combination, not quantitative, but between the two different levels, that really makes the thing. So this code of conduct, by the way, was not just a matter of personal opinion or taste or fashion, right? Mercenaries had to operate, and soldiers in general, because what's the difference, by the way? And this is not actually an insult to the soldiery at all. That's literally the same thing, right? They did have as many objective and subjective limits. They couldn't quite do what they wanted. There were communities that could still provide with substantial manpower and labor, and could simply stop them right at the end of the day. Europe was not taken over by soldiers of fortune at any time. When you actually, this is also a dark modernistic myth about the Middle Ages. There is a moment of the soldiers of fortune. Look at what terrible time it really was. When you actually study what happened, is that the same powers that existed at the time actually strengthened dramatically exactly in those years, and what you see as these companies roaming around was just these powers throwing them at each other, and these companies actually not taking over anything for themselves, and remaining essentially alienated and coming back wherever they came from, while European states were actually consolidating to an unprecedented degree. So be extremely aware of most of what you've been told in this narrative is fundamentally wrong at the very historical core. At the highest level of military hierarchy, that were, by the way, overlapping with the social steps of the ladder, right? The concept of honor, as we intended, so that is in reference to the moral dignity and the social value and beyond, the general metaphysical status of each one, thought in strict reciprocal relation, was, let's say, surely present. It had always existed, but it had not been extended because of the traditional role of the cases/estates to a much higher, say, to a much wider pool of people that naturally belong mostly to the lower classes. Now, in the 16th century, there is a very important process that happens in the spread of this recognition, essentially, of the faculty of wielding the imperium, right? And don't get me wrong, when I say that this was an incredibly brutal and effective ancien regime world that was extremely rigid, even compared to the Middle Ages. It was more, it was milder really in those terms. It doesn't mean that there wasn't an expansion, of course, of the concept of, I'd say, of the pool of professional capacity. Among these masses of men, that we're not talking about mass society yet, but definitely that were, say, fielded in ever larger and more, in fact, disciplined groups, right? So exactly because it's an ancien regime reality, you have, since we have seen it also with like the mid-14th century crisis, an increased distinction, also social one, and one of honor, between the soldier, right, and the rest of the population was, say, largely ever more demilitarized in historical trend and perspective. If you're interested in this topic especially, I advise you two videos I made. One is a pretty sort of algorithmic one about the Landsknechts that naturally are really it's not a happy ending story, right? Because they had their own rise and fall within the 16th century. But it tells you, especially in a country like Germany, it was very feudal in nature compared to the rest of Western Europe, what kind of, in fact, being Central Europe rather, for the majority, that rise to probably being a servant of the state, but being provided with the faculty of bearing arms. And so having, as you know, during the pretty tormented Reformation, the Peasant Wars in Germany and so on, that sense of, of purpose through redemption of their own social condition, and so they had a sort of union on their own, and so the pride associated to the bearing of arms that was finally coming back to resemble, for that also, so number, right, of people that were involved now in these new formations of Pagenschall. Think about the Tercio, think about other experiments all across Europe, really similar to what classical antiquity had been. Now armies were bigger, more orderly. That's the reason why also humanism, the Renaissance, were bringing just naturally, and obviously back on the fore, ancient Macedonian, Roman military treatise. Even though this system was actually way more advanced than that one, right? But the same problems in terms of training and discipline now were representing themselves, because it was simply a greater unity of command, this more concentrated power, so greater discipline that allowed, right, to reason again along similar patterns to one of antiquity. Hence, through the same classical philology, the resumption of the concept of honors, that was honors, also honor, it's properly the Roman god belonging to the following of Mars, and is essentially the soldier's protector, and very close to the concept of virtus itself, because it really focused on the man that was the warrior, and that mostly, let's say, pertained to the dimension of individual valor, but in relation to status earned through arms, and so within this community of fighters, right? So these ancient meanings were being rediscovered in the literal sociological function that they were reacquiring exactly at this point, right? It's as if, just to be extremely brutal, and it's evidently not true, but the Middle Ages had been the triumph of barbarian war bands, right? And now with a stricter army discipline, these sort of cohesive values at that larger scale were being reinforced. Then, of course, during the Middle Ages, I mean, you don't have to, of course, to tell me how orderly and disciplined and large actually many medieval armies actually were, right? There are lots of videos on YouTube going around, like, why were medieval armies so small, right? And then making just a technologistic, materialistic, deterministic explanation. Medieval armies were not small as long as the political will to bring on the field that amount of troops that really marched at the same speed of ancient armies that were basically the same size and whatever could be done, which was not even that infrequent, especially by late medieval times, also high medieval time, where you always find that medium of 30,000 men is in the big pitched battle. Of course, certain moments like the early Middle Ages wouldn't see that as often, but say warfare was pretty much all over the place, and it's like in relative terms not really true that pitched battles were that rare during medieval times, right? I studied specifically these things in my research, and it's just the fact that people remember certain battles that became sort of the meme they find in medieval warfare encyclopedias that do not even tell you, of course, of many other and sometimes even more important battles just out of sheer ignorance of the authors and their academic background. But because nobody makes you study, makes you research the actual, entirety of battles that were being fought and why, right? From not just the military but also the political standpoint in a given region across a certain amount of time. But the sense, in fact, that honor was being recovered for the individual soldier, as it now sort of signified the magic role that moral surplus to mere individual force to make actually discipline, make collective training work, was being reacquired also in a rational sense, by the way, in this broader awareness of the fact, of course, that heroes are intelligent while barbarians are stupid. As strength is beaten by intelligence, even though you always need both, that was especially the deeper insight, especially from Roman military thinking, as opposed to the Greek one that at some point had come to fully rationalize everything, right? To say it's just discipline, like Thucydides says in his Peloponnesian War, while you cannot cross out the virtues, hence the reappearance of honest as well, right? And concerning the hierarchical relations, these are also presented in the 16th century in a way that resembles more the one we're habituated to from a military point of view, that is to say, through the birth of officiality, right? Officers that would be, we will see it in another video, hopefully, that is also quite gradual and complex thing. And of course there were basically officers in a less standardized way in medieval times as in any other in practice, as the functions also at unit level are basically always the same, so you can't quite be that picky about it, right? And everything that had existed before had been working for the context in which it was needed, so it's not really that strange. And so the context doesn't quite change by itself. It's still people that make it work, and so you can see this improvement overall from the same medieval basis, which basically the Renaissance in fact is the product of, right? So you can argue in the sense that obedience was in a political social sense was stronger than discipline itself. So it's difficult to specifically measure what was the level of obedience as separated to the one of discipline, right? We can definitely understand that, as we said before, as long as there was a deeper personal bond between a leader and a follower, the, say, discipline in combat had to do mostly with that form of relation, and it would have not been necessarily greater, because that sort of closer connection could have brought to very high levels of individual prowess, also because, in the absence of a collective discipline, an effective collective discipline of some level, that's what you would compensate with, right? But of course, when discipline kicked into a larger level, in that sort of statal capacity of impressing that uniform group capacity, right, of crushing just so through the order of the formation, its maneuvers, and so on, things began to change in terms of cultural paradigm, right? There could be again, many other ways this would happen historically. Again, even a religious contingent. Think about the military, the monastic military orders, had tried to essentially militarize the existence of individuals, both in an individual and in a collective way. But the most important concept there was being truly both. Right, so it was a product of the peak of feudal professionalism that could, in fact, entail both and cost an enormity. Right, in modern times, the means were start to be available as much as creating this collectively disciplined formations, which the actual individual training was pretty poor compared to previous times, but still, as orderly masses led by more powerful leaders, hierarchically, were definitely more effective, and civilization being expanding like that, losing surely something in the process, surely lacking in part that, in fact, universal cohesion. Think about the Reformation, and turning individuals in sort of more consumable goods, we can say, as long as, however, the collective effectiveness would bring its fruits. So this entailed a level of alienation, if you want, that we will see now better, overlapping with some aspects of Protestant doctrine. There is, of course, a necessary mental habit to change in this mechanism, and many things happening on the ethical and juridical level as well, right? The obedience to the legitimate prince and his representatives was fundamental, right? In the modern age, treatises living relatively in the shadow, other aspects of the just war, emphasize rather now the legitimate authority as the one of the monarch, fundamentally, that declared war, and also the moral irresponsibility of those who basically worked for it, meaning that, right, it was believed that if you followed again that leader for a reason that now seemed ever more detached from your own relation with him, given that armies were larger and you would just join for sort of for an employment rather than else. It had always been that, but now it seemed somehow, because of the aforementioned hierarchy and gap between the elite and the masses, something less visible, in fact, from the bottom of society, right? This did entail, however, also a greater capacity, in fact, to retain these people. When you look at confessional wars of the 16th and the 17th century, you realize that, as it had in part happened during the Crusade, etc., people with different confessions were still fighting under different banners without too much of a problem. I mean, how many Catholics existed in Protestant armies on a regular basis, and vice versa, right? How many different religionaries had been fighting for another group? in the Mediterranean, how many Muslims from North Africa were actually siding with the which Christian powers, by the way, essentially with the Holy Roman Empire, with Spain, to counter the Ottomans and fighting the French in the process. This had really always existed, but now it was becoming just more self-evident because these states were bigger, and so, as we've seen often with the Franco-Turkish alliance, you couldn't quite simply unload the responsibility for this religious betrayal that was really deeply felt at this time. It would still for a long time. It's not that the French were particularly enjoying their alliance with the Turks; they just needed it for keeping France standing, right? But now, in fact, it was recognized at that same national level, and it brought to very deep sort of implications that also made all these various scholars and authors reflect more on the same. There was equally not entirely clear, because at this point there is the boom of printing of all these different religious sort of thoughts, heresies, schisms. Everybody could say very much like today what they want, but this doesn't necessarily lead the path, especially without a clear objective. That was also, however, and because of this chaos, a very violent debate on, for example, the right to disobey to unjust orders. Right? It's obvious that the Reformation, especially reviving Paul, Augustine, etc., was insisting on this sort of detachment, just in mechanism between conscience and what was happening in the world out there. And this could be very instrumental also to actually betray a cause rather than remaining consistent with one, right? So this, in other words, fueled, in fact, the same sort of branch of same brooklet eventually would mount up like a true river of the treatise on the raison d'etat, as much as the same monarchomacy. So those theories were respectively reinforcing monarchic prerogatives and battling them. And so, in this sense, modernizing thought, right? And so, making essentially moral relativism out of what up to even the previous century would have seen as an insanity. And that really gives you the idea of how dramatic actually the 16th century really was, right? We celebrated for the Renaissance, but as a matter of fact, this was by far one of the worst centuries as it was perceived by the contemporaries in European history, right? Yet this idea that the soldier had already been released from personal responsibility as far as the unjust war that he may have been fighting was substantially in the air. So that, again, the responsibility would have burdened mostly those who had told him to leave. For example, Shakespeare tells us in his Henry V that on the field of Azincourt, the English ruler would recur to these ideas, at least to in part solve the doubts, to dispel the doubts of his men, and to even lift their morale, right? Indicating that there was substantially, and of course in Shakespeare's time at least, a very important, very strong concern from the side of the soldiery about the actual issues of this war. Of course, they could have had all the problems with it possible, also not connected with the war in itself. Maybe some of them just were afraid to die in the first place. And in fact, we also see that in spite of all these efforts to even guarantee the soldiers they would have not been fighting for, say, by fighting would have not really had to join the moral cause and responsibility of the ruler. This was, at the end of the day, too traditional of an idea for, let's say, these people to simply forget that, right? Because the traditional meaning of the imperium was, of course, not morally relativistic. If you fought under a given and for a given guy, you were still just pushing from that direction against another. That could be also it was never about being right or wrong in absolute terms, because, as we've seen, just he who won technically had won also the righteousness that came with victory, and so the Holy Ghost. But aside from the fact that it's very rare to find quite clear-cut victories and defeats, especially in a political sense, even public responsibility of those who fought for a certain ruler could not simply be forgotten, where you couldn't quite say, well, I'm just fighting this army because I need to, I need money, but I'm not actually supporting this guy. You're actually breaking skulls with the guys from the other side. It's obvious that this was an unrealistic issue, but given that, again, the lesser people in the modern age were ever more alienated and sort of, in fact, decadent in quality per capita, you could easily tell them this just to convince them that it was kind of okay. Just like, I don't know, just pay the indulgences, or, just make all the sacraments, but that's it, basically, right? You don't have to make a spiritual effort, to make contrition, to repent. They would have in partly gone with that, because these were just fourth estaters at the end of the day, and so they didn't understand the mere concept of religion, and even if they thought to be, of course, Christians, etc., but they lived under a superstition. They didn't actually believe, like leaders did, for the obvious, evidence at some point, and especially the most successful ones had what it took to win, and why, and so what were also the broader costs of war, in a more comprehensive sense. Well, you couldn't quite picture the drama of it all, right? Remember that it's truly the leaders that have the whole burden on their shoulders, right? The soldier in the field can even die, but the moral pressure is never going to be as much as the one that those in charge really have, and it's a pretty scary position to be in. And since we live in a fourth estate ideology, in which people again still believe in the myth of the butchers and all this stuff, they can't really distinguish what happened historically, politically, or morally. Of course, the idea is flipped, right? These poor guys were brought to fight, right? And of course, there is this sort of, again, hyper entity above that you do not understand what it really is, but so you do not have fault. It's just these guys, right? You understand how much it has inflated and how many disasters this has been actually causing, because exclusively of people's moral, personal, and cultural inferiority, like the ones that basically they have, especially nowadays. And so at this time, the thing was emerging in a bit more of a this is not about the absolute levels of moral or material misery. This is about the relative terms compared to the structures and to what had to be achieved. It's also the understanding of the possibility that times were, the understanding that times were changing in the first place, and so that even that older possibility of simply being, I don't know, the boss's servant was not enough anymore to change. Of course, we couldn't change the world simply from there, but paradoxically, it was the world was simpler back then, so you could see more directly the consequences of your actions. Let's put it in this way. So discipline, and this is the point of today's video, was making this very sort of strange of effect on soldiers, right? Because individually, as we've seen, the quality of the troops was decaying. I mean, there is no doubt. You cannot think that an 18th century fantassin was anywhere, but not even remotely, more capable or intelligent than a 13th century knight, or even of a 5th century rank and file warrior, right? But of course, the guy could simply pull a trigger, and defeat these ancestors, right? Naturally, it's not about that only, because still in the 18th century, actually, you could have defeats at the hands even of primitive peoples around the world. But let's say the same fantassin had definitely could be provided much larger numbers, because it was simply effective as operating through mostly the mass of that firepower than even just the individual one. This is particularly important to stress, because it's not just like Indiana Jones, like, guy showing up with scimitars and, you just shooting him with a gun and ending the thing. Because, of course, nobody's really stupid. So in the moment in which, and there isn't such a great distance from, especially at this time, people are in another, right, in terms of development of the art of war. But as long as you see, say, a brutal divide that brings you in a condition of inferiority, you're not going out there to get slaughtered. You will do something else, and there are lots of things that you can do, even as a culturally underdeveloped people, when, of course, you're able to realize that if you met with those conquerors in open ground, it would simply be a carnage, right? So the effect of discipline, however, as a sort of even of metaphysical tool, because essentially the same Imperium, the Holy Ghost, was permeating all these armies, and so it was understood, rather in fact, that the individual's capacity, it was fundamentally the way, the merit of the collective merit of the army would bring to bear its greater fruits, and so discipline now was being seen as an aim, much more than it had been before, because it was understood systemically that investing on that could, even in spite of the absolute costs of war increasing, still making you save enough, not making you spend more, and still, given that you were fighting against armies that spent, policies that spent the same for the armies, give you an edge in that direction, right? So this was an ancient value, very well known, especially if you read Justus, right? The idea that in battle, discipline is much more important than force. You can even see Justus as a Byzantine source by now. And you understand there that sort of even increased Greek bias of Thucydides that applied Justus being a traditionalist, right, and looking at the great times of Rome, was actually forgetting a bit the, let's say, what had been the right combination of the virtus and discipline, right? And so mistaking even force just for the virtus, which is not quite the thing. It also entailed the wisdom to understand what discipline was, how discipline was necessary. In fact, this was the quality of the war band leaders that still needed, of course, to impose a collective discipline. That's why they were leaders in the first place, and why these were armies in the first place. So it's something as old as warfare, aside from what specific, as doesn't matter how famous, sources really state. Right, so one of the reasons for which, for example, in the 16th century, the Spanish infantrymen were so much praised, rested in their silent discipline. Right, the idea that you don't have really to do to brag too much, to focus too much even on yourself, right? You must just follow orders, and of course being fully committed, because as we just said, there is a virtus that must make that happen. But it's rather that full, at that point, professional capacity to move those regiments that really that required all that collective training that made the game. Similar appreciations, by the way, were addressed even in the Christian world, of course, to the Ottoman Janissaries. Because, of course, the Ottoman Empire had one of the single most centralized systems at the time. It was sort of less thriving compared to Western Europe in other ways. But surely the idea that there was this head concentrated in Constantinople and the Janissaries were the Sultan's own children, trained rigidly just to be something almost, in fact, spiritual. They had actually a confession of their own, as opposed to the one of the Ottoman feudal sort of nobility, we can say, well, was, the marble bit of that world. So consider in all this, of course, cavalry as such was indeed entering a crisis, right? It's not much that aristocracy was entering a crisis, or at least this was becoming ever more hierarchical. It was cavalry as an arm that had still embodied that greatness of the warrior, of that peak of individual, not just collective discipline that now was being butchered on the battlefield. So cavalry was never ended, right? It was never eliminated. On the contrary, right, it was in the second half of the 16th century to start rising again, and the role of knights on horseback was still actually pretty strong and that's what every ruler had to be about. There is also, however, this emphasis on the importance of foot combat. This is true in, for example, among the same hidalgos of the Spanish tercios. It is true for the leaders of the Landsknecht, for example. Think about the Frundsberg at Pavia, guys that, and this, in fact, this fashion spread throughout all the Catholic armies, right? That, right, this, even the noblemen, while joining the army, starting from the final rank pikemen, right? Of course, they had all the favors and all, but they were to pass through that orderly, as a matter of fact. And we've seen it also in the video about Montecuccoli, etc. It was especially an imperial thing that had been motivated especially by the Spanish, but had this more universal idea, and still showed you, by the way, how the average pikeman, even in these armies, was not thought yet as a simple automaton, a simple fantassin, right? There was something more of true warriorism that, after all, in spite of this large pike formations, was still pretty necessary, right? Not just in line of principle as an element of military prowess, but literally for the type of engagements that could be provided. Because also in here, not every battle is an open field one. These guys fought in so many other ways, in many circumstances, right? And in fact, we today focus mostly on this collective discipline, but at the time that was, albeit appreciated and recognized, still part of a world that was much more rooted and aware of the older traditional beliefs than anything, even as the role of the individual fighter, etc. The 16th century authors also posed themselves the problems of discipline. They agreed fundamentally, and they could have not done otherwise at the time, telling the truth, in stating that on, in fact, disciplinary level, the ancients had been superior to the moderns, right? again, by approximation, if you look at the order, arms synergy and size of some medieval armies, especially at the peak of the great medieval civilization, well, you see there a discipline that had nothing to really to envy to the ones of the Roman legions and the Macedonian phalanxes. There was surely a different arms ratio, meaning that Middle Ages had loaded dramatic cavalry at some point, because society and politics were different. So the infantry was, today we think the infantry was the future, but let's say in the 13th century that was evidently not believed yet, right? So there were at different times in history different ideas and awareness. Even the 15th century, people think the 15th century was this boom of infantry. This is true, yes, from the Swiss, right, in the mid 15th century, but say there hadn't been up to that point an increasing importance of infantry compared. There were times in the 15th century in which infantry was less important than it had been in the early 14th, right? So it's never that linear at all, and consider that this varies greatly also from a geographical point of view. In any case, when we look at Machiavelli, for example, we realize that some authors, even essentially the greatest military theorists of his time, did not really and fully appreciate training for what it was. Right? You got to understand, Machiavelli was not a man of war, right? He was not a soldier. He was a diplomat, right? He was a bureaucrat, financially. And so he looks at politics. He looked at so many things, and we're all enormously thankful for this pillar of Western civilization. But when you look at discipline, of course, you realize that he preferred civic conscience to that, right? It was in this sense, this was a more Hellenic idea from classical readings than a Roman one, right? Of course, Machiavelli stressed the importance of training, especially of punishment. That the Romans were much harsher. That was a Roman influence, by the way. Consider that discipline comes from disciplina, which comes from disco, that is to say, to learn, to really to acquire, right? And so it's something you must receive, right? It's something you can't quite. That's the difference between a, say, military levies and professionals, right? It's literally that you can't quite receive materially something like professional discipline, right? And so there is a massive difference between a true professional soldier and any other fighter, an amateur. This, say, different interest, right, discipline across different authors, and even the most important ones, derived from the fact that naturally many of them were not military men. And so Machiavelli, for example, would see the technical behavioral element as just under in hierarchical importance to the political one. Now this was correct, right? But it was founded on a republicanistic model that is, again, similar to what the Greeks believed, that is, to citizens, that is, as long as you are a good citizen, you perfectly know what to do in battle. Well, that's not so automatic at all, right? With the connection between politics and war rather stands in the fact that, that the community, as a political body, finds out the ways how to train the citizens for being soldiers, right? And which is a completely different dimension in the costs, and you can't quite militarize the entire citizenry, etc. So the same Machiavelli, as you know, was saying basically that most of the soldiers had to be really peasants as opposed to the citizens, right? From Florence, of course, there was this old idea, because they were quite also economically conservative and, say, already in other realities that had I don't know, Milan or Venice, they had quite different ideas. We're not talking about the papal condottieri for that matter. And so it's just different worlds, but just be aware that when you read Machiavelli, you read Florence and you don't read another place, right? A very important source that is not even contemporary to Machiavelli because he was born 20 years after his death was Justus Lipsius. All right, it was a Flemish, a Brabançon scholar, Protestant one, that had been quite interested. He had been studying a lot the Roman military art, right? And he realized deeply that the actual hinge between the physical practice as body technique, let's say, in a very precise ethical context that does require, of course, an individual action, that is your own self-control, right, and the scrupulous observance of the orders that are given to you. Now, there is a limit in this because, say, orders are difficult, say, to, for example, an Italic warrior, while he's being transformed into a Roman legionnaire, to obey, right? Well, there's something else very differently from, say, a 16th century levy that has to fight as a in a pike shot and shot system. As we've seen, there is, of course, an overlapping ground of combativeness, of aggressiveness, of sort of, individual prowess as well, that mixes. Again, these are not particularly different times from the same medieval ones in the art of war. This sense of collective capacity, especially in the age of firearms, has become something different. It has to do with standing, for example, still under fire, being able to, again, move perfectly geometrically, linearly, as it had been required to some, of course, armies in the past. But that was at this point pushed by a much greater force intrinsic in modern civilization that was sort of literally obliterating the value of the individual for the one of the greater good. This had always been the case, but it had never been so strong, so pushing, and so also fast accelerating, so that it had become more difficult even for those who had to confer that discipline to actually succeed in doing this orderly, and especially when there was all this friction, right, intrinsic primarily in the political and social system rather than the military one, right? But this is also how modernity happened. So this iron discipline, the immediate obedience requested in an absolute way, even the monotonous and sort of really exhausting marches in the parade grounds, right? These were all new, let's say, challenges asked, at least in the measure, say, in the quantitative measure, and also in the different scale of the previous, compared to the previous centuries. We know that Maurice of Nassau was particularly sensitive to this sort of disciplinary training requirements on the basis of the ancient military treatise. He is the one who led the Dutch army fundamentally to the reconquest of most of its land from the Spanish, and we have seen when talking about him how, of course, all these theoretical insights were quite important. There was an ever and practical need for uniformation and regularization, but of course also military practice was something else, and that also these armies really were basically heading towards the same direction autonomously. That's where Justus Lipsius had actually played a great role, because fundamentally he was a Stoic, right? He was supporting the Protestant cause, and he had come up with this interesting, especially from his confessional background, idea of what the soldier had to sacrifice in order to achieve that level of discipline, right? So first of all, he said he had to be able to bend his body to his own will, right? This could be interpreted in different terms, because traditionally this was seen as the warrior being able to transcend his own fallen nature, right? By elevating, however, transfiguring the saying. Here the Protestant background was really saying something else. It is to say that, of course, there was no way that could happen, because humans cannot save themselves with any work whatsoever. So what they should have done, basically, was just crushing their body, right? And so becoming an instrument of God anyway, in that fashion. But learning simply how to do it. I mean, not simply, evidently, but still, right, realizing this enormous sacrifice, right? So, in other words, it was an ascetic request, that is to say, learn how to essentially resist pain by yourself, and only then, Justus Lipsius said, adequate your will that you have trained in such a way to the one of your leaders, of your superiors. Now, this is particularly fascinating because it reflects quite limpidly how, in this sense, the lack of value of works, and so of humanity entirely in the Protestant confession, was also in parallel with the sort of loss of connection between your own internal struggle and the one of, let's say, political intelligence, right? In other words, you had just to obey what you were told, not because you had to have too many ambitions. You had just to be able to suffer whatever and go on with that, right? And what your superiors simply told you to do, you had to do, right? Naturally, Justus has a complex theory behind this, but what is important here is the emphasis on, say, the paradox that, as we will see better now, that Protestantism was really requesting to these soldiers. So just believe that this must happen, but this is not going to contribute at all to anything, because your works are worthless, right? You just must do it, right? Because there is a greater will that wants it, and you just must sort of train yourself to accept it, rather than just like you have to obey the hierarchy, right? And this, as you know, also in historically, is a bit the idea that emerges stereotypically where studies about Nazism or other societies, especially the militaristic Protestant ones emerging in the later centuries, like as just being rigid, like non-thinkers regarding the broader picture, but just having this idea: God, king, church, family. This is basically it, right? And then there is you, but all you have to do is simply to obey, and not questioning anything, not thinking that your work just per se is your merit, that is just happening for whichever reason. Just know that you're a sinner. You must just accept this higher authority. Now, this is not to say that in the Catholic world this brutality did not exist at all, right? But it was starting from different theological sort of bases, in which, after all, works did matter and did contribute to your own salvation. So what you were doing on the battlefield was, at least in a disciplinary sense, channeled in such a way that you had contributed through the same medium, through the same higher authority, and hopefully, in fact, the universal one. And even there, the contradictions that existed. Thinking Spain, that yes, was under the Habsburg, was not under the Empire. How do you consider that, right? But it's the modern era. In fact, it's a different time. But at least in this sense, you had hopefully contributed to this. It was the same contribution you could give to, I don't know, the Valhalla, right? It was just being there, earning your place in this sort of preliminary heaven to wait for the end time, and so to hope that your struggle, that the force that you had cultivated in life, could be spent for winning the eternal clash, right, at the end time. Now, so this, going back to Justus Lipsius, this reiterated action of determined movements up to the reaching of the millimetric exactness and the mechanical automatism of the gestures themselves, had its own conceptual origin and ethical justification, not just in, as we've seen, the neo-Stoic philosophy of Justus, but mostly in the corroboration of the austere Calvinist asceticism, right? For Maurice of Nassau to dispose of men whose gestures were accurately measured, limited in time and space, standardized if you want, was indispensable from a military point of view, a strictly military point of view. In the moment in which you literally needed these guys to work with their musket according to a rigorous order of line, to maneuver what was at that time actually a very heavy weapon. The muskets basically had evolved out of essentially portable artillery within a fairly limited spatial context, and to alternate themselves with continuous counter marches in order to maintain line by line fire continuity. So this again was happening basically in every European army, right? But these sort of ascetic repetition, this sort of alienation, if you want, something we have seen in fact sublimated even in those videos about Frederick the Great's army, how in the 18th century they trained the guys to just shoot continuously without even technically aiming properly, but just being able to do so. Because they would have broken, say, order, they would have messed up everything in battle as well, but being habituated to do that under this hell of fire with smoke, terrifying sound, etc., was already what was sort of hypnotizing them, right? It was just the rolling of the drum. This was a typically Dionysian system that especially demasses the earthly element, not like the trumpets, the Apollonian sounds that of the charging knights, right? Was sort of habituating this scum of the earth that basically early modern infantry really was, considering their Fourth Estate background, to largely, at least, as it was spreading anyway, with ever larger armies drawn for this background. The most obvious subordination of these individuals to whatever authority. So the depletion of, again, individual prowess in favor of this collective mechanism that has to still to be civilizationally maneuvered. Right, the way these guys would learn how to fire, etc., was something that they could have never truly learned by themselves. They literally needed to go on a parade ground to exercise that, because there were officers, commanders that really knew what what they couldn't see from their own limited perspective, right? So the if you want, the dehumanization even of the individual was particularly needed here, and especially the mechanic way that you have just to be able to kill and to do all what you have to do under that hellish circumstance is something that is still present in our training. It turns out that at least instinctively humans tend not to kill immediately, while this is exactly what we must forcefully train them for in the military, so that as soon as they're able to recognize the target, they're going to be able to shoot them and to terminate them in the most effective and quick and safe possible way, together with a minimal collapse, right? Due to the worry of an instant, for example, the one of actually having to avoid a cannonball, for example, which was something that would happen. Ricochet was more finalized exactly to scaring, like to actually see the ball arriving than hitting in the formation, because the purpose was exactly the soldier seeing that getting out of the way, messing up the order of the formation, which could have in fact determined some disorder, and the mission of the soldier in this regard was to just automatically perform those maneuvers without even literally thinking of what they had in front of them. Right? These were done under fire, and that's why they repeated them over and over and over and over and over again, because they had simply to do them without any fear. Right, the same repetition basically puts the soldier in a sort of mental safe place that he had been already so many times before, that even the outer space was not really would have bothered him less, let's say. Then of course it was difficult to remain impassible in front of these things, but concretely, right, that's how the entire purpose of maneuver training really was, and the idea was essentially instilling to the soldiers as much as possible the realization that if you stuck to that training, to that repetition, you could and you would simply avoid losses, right? And this is not a wrong concept. I mean, the idea is that if you have actually good leadership that knows what you're doing, and of course if you were devoid of fear and you just knew you could throw these soldiers in the most perfect orderly way against the enemy, even taking heavy losses but still maintaining cohesion, after all, not being impressed, not letting the moral dimension like disordering as it does more than the actual injuries, the physical injuries, the formation further, you would have had a much more effective army, right? So the sense is, as crazy as it sounds, you must do what we tell you to do, right? Because if you do so, you're just mathematically avoiding more losses. Yes, somebody's gonna die, but if for that guy it would have been 3, let's say, if in fact the wall had not followed the entire procedure properly, right? So psychologically, training had literally to empty the mind of the soldier to some, at least at the moment. And of course these men knew what they were being trained for say, in any context, more or less, and so concentrating the attention on the gestures, the rhythms, and all the sort of big show that warfare really was. It had almost an entertaining, choreographed, musical dimension, right? It was really designed to win, right? To have the spirit rising above hell itself, right? And this was all aiming at freeing the soldier, even from fear itself, right? It was sort of gestual magic form. And at the basis of all this, there is, of course, a sort of self-denial, right? Self-sacrifice. That there is in part the dehumanization, but not necessarily in a negative sense, but literally the abandonment of the fallen human. In fact, that means dirty, earthy dimension, which again can be obtained in different ways. It's very difficult, of course, from a psychological point of view to simply rationalize this, right? How can you fully bring this formation of man to act forcefully in an through as an impersonal mechanism, right? In times in which, by the way, there are some mechanistic, even philosophies. There are these great metaphors of the various gears, etc. Think about clockwork, the same, wheel lock pistols working thanks to the work of clockmakers at the time. The passion for machines and mechanisms in general, which essentially looked at that sense of opening to experimentation, to that great alchemic say dream of creating the perfect machine that can really bring say that means really to sort out the universe, right? Except, of course, this was done in much less poetical and sort of celestial ways that you would imagine, because of course the scenes that you would have observed in such context were definitely dramatic, to say the least, and of course based on an incredible carnage and sort of extreme, say, sacrifice and bloodshed and disorder and chaos, just like war can be to some degree, but where this order was understood at least to be the only way out. And so these men, as always in war, are required to transcend their own limits. Except again that, as we observed before, a medieval knight would have been cultivated with a much greater awareness about his own role into this. And now, for different ideologies that mostly have to do with the collapse of universal beliefs, these were just soldiers brutally put there and just forced to obey specific mechanisms and not even getting much of the training that even their ancient counterparts would have had to withstand firepower. The same pike and shot warfare was essentially based on the concept that for how many pikemen could be shot before they arrived to the enemy, of course, that there would have been enough just to overwhelm the shot, right? And then in that sense it was combined arms. There were shots and pikes from both sides, and that's why, Clausewitzianly speaking, what at the end of the day this sort of alienating discipline was about could not by itself simply win the whole thing, right? It was a giant, obvious sort of manual-based necessity for making armies work better overall, and especially in, say, maneuvering and deployment, etc. But then, since the odds were brutally balanced, of course, warfare was to be won on the basis still of a moral force, one base of an actual honor, an actual virtue, right, and combativeness and aggressiveness and bloodthirst, and so all what eventually makes the actual battle. So you see how, despite getting it right in a technical sense, say modern say word was slightly drifting away from the actual sort of practical, say, moral side of the story. I was saying practical because this is practical enough. These are actually just the mechanisms that you have to follow. But without moral force, you could not really have achieved that in the first place. So there is, of course, more to it. There are the Stoic dictamina relative to the abnegation of your own self-control, the embridlement of passions. But this sort of submission to constituted authority the cult of personal sacrifice, all this does confer the soldier some practical purposes, but it's still, say, war is still based on the necessity, yes, of surviving, but also winning, and that must be wanted, and the soldier individually must also be able to be provided with that degree of autonomy that can allow him not just to simply and passively adapt to the circumstances. And in fact, this was the main problem with the Protestant ethics, because it was instead sort of eliminating the hope that your own individual effort, let's say not much your effort, but the active will to make that effort to have an actual effect in a metaphysical sense, not just in battle, right? So of course, not all soldiers, or not nearly the majority, were trained in this theology and in this philosophy. These were just the ideas that were circulating at the time, because of course the process of imposition was being asserted even in a disciplinary way, as essentially like, if you don't obey, it will kill you, which is the also practically more effective way to deal with, maybe not exactly to provide with this perfect mechanism, but what was enough to have, of course, most orders, obeyed. It's difficult to distinguish, in this sense, the cultural dimension, even the confessional one, from strict political reasons, right? For example, in some decades from Justus Lipsius, such values and such style would have perfectly adapted exactly to a country that so much owed to that Calvinist experience that was tied to the same royal house, that is Prussia. Right? Think about all the Huguenots that had been expelled from France. Think about what France was becoming, and just by the will of actually a Catholic monarch that had expelled his Protestants and that had turned his own country into the first truly modern army, and making, had turned his army into the first style modern one, and his country into the first hegemonic power in Europe. Prussia developed instead its own fierce discipline that definitely was to provide with the highest, the most qualitative, most disciplined army of his times, because it was desperate to survive, which is a completely different point, right? And this would be developed further, especially in the 18th century, that we're all aware of. It's difficult to connect it to a country or another, right? We make videos also about this, and so the need of the uniform, right? How this developed, in fact, among those armies that were sort of more tactically dynamic, right? We've seen it among the Swedes, for example, that were also Protestant power and were during the 30 Years' War presented with essentially the finest force out there. So this is all a practical need just to manage, very often at also pretty large scale, just to distinguish actually the troops, the regiments that you needed to move on the field. So it's something definitely going beyond ethics, just per se. But the soldiers were fighting, right, in those units were, of course, real people, and so they had to be, in spite of this randomness where they came from, still to be framed within a mindset that had to go send them fighting in that way. there is again a practical economical reason with the same color cloth, and so the uniform was used for the soldiers' dress, and you can argue, for example, also in the Puritan New Model Army. And the interesting aspect of this, however, is political, because if you think about that, these powers were all sort of fighting against constituted authority, right? We made videos about the English Civil War, dress even, and so we have seen how the New Model Army could just, it was very modern and updated, right? And it was based on London, it could have so much supplies, etc., whereas the monarchists that were more in the outskirts of Britain were more poorly dressed, but still their leaders used much more flamboyant clothes, because they were still based on the sense that they were the retinue of a monarch as opposed to the army of a parliament, right? And so things were intersecting definitely at different levels, on this. And you understand that modernity pushed for the more sort of popular mean, that however doesn't mean that it was not actually as such an instrument posed in the hands of much actually more powerful governments. And this had to do with the reasons why the political cohesion had come about, right? Definitely a New Model Army wasn't particularly challenging for what, I don't know, the French army would have become. And so you have quite different models there. But, right, you have surely different political and strategic contexts for which these armies had come about. So you must consider this when evaluating them. Aside from the practical problem, it's also rather instinctive to connect uniform with the rigor exercised, however, by the Puritans on their clothing. As you know, that was quite standardized, because the sense was that nobody had to presume to be better than another. It was a sin of pride, and after all, as we've seen, the works really didn't matter in this picture. So the exaltation of a sort of an individual character was further tamed. But we must understand, in fact, that in spite of these religious ideals, also in this case within the Commonwealth armies, there wasn't always the same rigor, right? A man such as the Major General Thomas Harrison, that had been known definitely as a staunch opponent of the aristocracy, was still famous for sort of showing chivalric ways and wearing sort of elegant clothes, because of course that elite could not quite be eliminated, right? The English Civil War didn't bring to the abolition of on the longer term of the monarchy either, right? Nor the say like later on would have been with the Glorious Revolution, etc. So the let's say here we're not necessarily looking, when looking at the ideology, especially at just one school of thought that was simply skipping the much more concrete problems that shared by all European armies, regardless, in fact, of confession, right? And if anything, the difference was in the scale of power, which was a very different thing. Of course, also the France of Louis XIV stressed the importance of uniform, so this definitely was not. Say in the uniform you can definitely transmit some values, depending even on the color and these things, but of course you need it equally to field ever larger armies that you couldn't evenly train in a qualitative sense, just right, because it was just collected in an individual. If you look at the single soldier, but just at the but just you had to provide these guys with the awareness, right, that they had to obey, in fact, and that if they did that minimum, the thing would work. Because in war, after all, what works is usually the good enough, not the best, right, in qualitative terms. The tendency, in any case, is definitely the one which would have led to the uniform. And in fact, in Prussia, it would have had great extreme in this limit. Also another institution of disciplinary perfectionment, that was the barrack, right? Consider that barracks did not quite exist as we intend them up to pretty late in time. In fact, the same second half of the 17th century, the 18th even. And by the latter, just the realization that discipline had somehow taken over Western warfare in this uniformed fashion is expressed at so many levels. Think about the Piedmontese Alfieri, that was a member of Savoy nobility, and that was thus destined to military career. He really was, not inclined for that personally, and he abhorred what he called the universal Prussian barrack. That is to say, at that point the Prussians were a bit the gold standard of discipline, for reasons that, telling the truth, were not that different from Savoy, because Savoy would militarize brutally, and so in part Alfieri was complaining against his own state in that way. But that was in fact pointing at, in fact, a European-wide necessity for discipline and homogeneity. Think about Martinet. Think about the different levels of collective discipline that in part have been forgotten, right? The fact that the French pace was faster normally than one of other countries, well, it simply is a consequence of the ambitions of continental hegemony of France. That said, like, if you want to have, say, armies that can cover really all our boundaries and being fast and reliable, well, we must accept, even as a sort of torture, that these guys have to march on a regular basis in ways that, of course, would vary in practice, but that had sort of been more than one of other countries, right? And that's the same reason why we said again that musketry training had to be carried out, for example, in that sort of crazy fashion that would be we'll come back on that of comparison, right? Oh, the various rates of fire, the necessity of staying in order till the last second, because in part it was not even about winning. It was, at least in that specific engagement, was saying that your unit was so aware, and that basically discipline was so much important than anything else, that, like it happened during the 7 Years' War, it would have been a bath of blood also of Prussian officers, because not just they had to join the army, to just participate into the demilitarization of the country, but they would have had never to break formation, even if they could have simply won at that point by breaking the ranks, because even more important than saving your own life was to know that you were a Prussian, because you would never break formation in that way. Naturally, it would happen, but that stubbornness was in practice the hallmark of reliability for the Prussian commanders to say, whatever these guys we tell, they will obey to do, right? And this, of course, considering also the Prussian military results, was largely correct. I mean, you wouldn't quite save alone, nor the Prussian army nor Prussia, as the miracles of the House of Brandenburg really show. But, right, they would at least surely contribute enormously to it in the many victories scored against, quite significant enemies that had their own discipline and quality, to say the least. Right? This is particularly important. So there is a sort of subtle irony, especially thinking about these Protestant countries, because it's exactly true their confession that Europe as a whole, this is true for the Catholics as well, was rediscovering, in order to adapt it to the soldiers, two parameters that had been very dear to the same Catholic world during the Middle Ages and that had been disconfessed by the Reformation. So first of all, the habit that we've seen recently also in those videos about, say, the Teutonic habit of literally, in fact, the warrior monks as a symbol of a rule, and so a discipline, a common life, right, that was in fact scanned by a very specific norm. And in fact, as it is notorious, the term disciplina in Latin during the Middle Ages was exquisitely monastic. Right? So think how this paradoxically, after all the confiscations of monasteries under Henry VIII, or all the sort of dramatic rejection of most of those orders, raison d'etre, we can say, the same thing was adopted, if you want, even at the bigger level at this point, but unavoidably at a lower standard considering the numbers of soldiers that were involved here. The same armies of Europe, starting a bit with this Protestant pride and strength that we've seen in countries like the Netherlands, Sweden, England, and others, as new powers, let's say, to modern Europe, and that were sort of showing the way how to do so also to the other countries, of course in a world in which, however, the traditional institutions were declining anyway, in quality, in success, and because at the end of the day, the reliance over that ancient fides individually, just like the awareness of the sacred in the heart of man, was really fading away. And so, of course, there is a very important power here to be seen, but also due to the fact that simply, as Europeans, we, as pretty much any other at this point, dramatically increased in number, thanks to this sort of mechanical processes that, however, at some points had a dramatic difficulty, to say the least, to this day, to regulate adequately on the same scale from a moral point of view. Right? So I think this topic is quite important and goes in parallel with the, the videos on uniforms, military dress, but also military music very much, and those aspects of even ethnic survival into uniforms that, in fact, I should point this out, I made a video about this, I will talk again about the same topic, were quite characteristic of some even knightly symbolism. Think about the Uhlans, the dragoons, the hussars. Well, these, of course, had a much more active and sort of, in fact, Apollonian tactical role, in spite of some of them being really low level, right? Because they were much more dynamic, much more equestrian, much more sort of not just sitting there and shooting and are waiting to be shot down, but really acting with much greater predatorial mentality than what the Fourth Estate infantryman could do just with mass and this sort of, as the individual was concerned, cheap training, intense training, dumb, brutal training, but say all aimed at making this thing working as a whole, right, rather than as just the individual, and always maintaining, of course, that in the past no society had, hardly any society had, let's say, a satisfactory level of, say, when fielding large forces, quality and quantity. Right, just during ancient times, say the Roman army, you have something like there's a hell of a compromise. You have other ones in history with that similar balance, but now, right, that sort of virtus and discipline had dramatically shifted in favor of discipline, even though you can never erase virtue from, as far as that true meaning of, say, fighting and aggression and an individual prowess are required when it comes to a one-to-one engagement that at the end of the day is going to happen to some degree. So we'll talk more about how the collective makes the actual, the actual job in battles, because of course, when, as we've seen in other videos, when we have analyzed battles, we've seen how, of course, even historically, we realized that these were settled by, say, how the various battle lines interacted as opposed to what, of course, single guys did. But it is still those single guys that make the battle lines, so it's not a fully impersonal reality. But and so one has to understand there what really matters, and it takes time, right, and practice and experience to actually understand how you can measure that. And collective training is definitely more important in the history of civilization than just individual prowess, hyper-concentrate. That also has a cost, and we will have to discuss this at some other point. Well, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.